Well, well, well. Here we are once again telling tales from park rangers. I just got back from my vacation yesterday and I'm ready to get back to hitting these stories. Thank you guys for sharing your stories and supporting all the videos that I had out while I was gone. Now, if you have a story you would like to share in a future video, whether it be a park ranger story or something completely different, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Now, let's get into these creepy, and quite honestly strange, park ranger stories. I've been a park ranger for about 5 years. I've worked in Delaware during that time. One of the scariest and most unnerving years of that work came in my 3rd year as a park ranger. It was during that time we started finding animals in less than whole states, to put it kindly. I remember these events just like they happened yesterday. It was a normal October morning when I was reporting in. The morning cleanup was going well enough, but by that afternoon we were called to an area in the woods by a worried hiker. They claimed to have found something horrific while hiking. Their claims were well beyond true. I told my supervisor I'd handle it, and if I had known what I was going to encounter, I probably never would have taken over. I'll be honest, I'm a brave guy, but this sort of thing that I'm about to tell you about is not the sort of thing any human should have to come across. When I arrived on the scene, I saw a 20-something-year-old woman crying and just absolutely mortified. I scanned the area and quickly realized why she was acting like this. All over the off-beaten trail she'd been hiking, there were bits and pieces of some sort of animal. At first we couldn't tell what it was, as the remains were spread everywhere. I remember my shock at the smell and just the repulsive nature of the scene. I comforted the woman and reassured her we'd handle it from here. I thanked her and radioed my supervisor. I told her she needed to come down and check out the scene. I also noted that I suspected some kind of animal had mauled another. When my supervisor arrived, the shock was clear in her face. She explained what she wanted us to do, and we began to clean up. I remember her walking off and making a phone call while I had some others clean the area. I could overhear the distress in her voice, but I thought nothing of it as I was pretty shaken by the sheer violence of the scene myself. The rest of the day was pretty normal, and before I knew it, it was time to head home. I slept unusually easily that night considering what I dealt with that day. In what seemed like no time at all, I awoke and it was morning already. I love my job, but I remember feeling like I hadn't slept and cursing out the sun as I got up. Let's face it, even if you love your job, you will have mornings where you're just like, man, already? It's time to go back? Anyway, I made some breakfast, got up and headed to work. I was in high spirits and hadn't thought much about yesterday's events until I arrived at work that morning. It was then I found an opened deer hanging from the entrance sign to our park. I could see its entrails laying around, the blood smeared all over the sign. My boss was already on the scene and just finishing a phone call. She gave me a somewhat sickened smile before telling me to clock in and come back out this way to help work and clean on the scene. I did just that, and upon arriving again at the scene, I couldn't help but ask my supervisor what she thought was going on. She explained she imagined some sort of animal was responsible just by the bodies, but she also mentioned she had never seen an animal do something this vicious before, let alone in Delaware. I remember cleaning and thinking to myself, is this going to be a remainder of my career? Should I start a business in animal cleanup? As though she could read my mind, my boss approached and put a hand on my shoulder before in somewhat morbid way, laughing and telling me, relax, we might just have a new career if we keep finding these scenes. I think she saw my shock when she just smiled and said, stop worrying, it was just a joke. I let out a half-hearted laugh and went back to work. The rest of that day and week, nothing weird or violent seemed to be happening. I remember clocking out on Friday, and mostly having forgotten the earlier events of the week. My boss mentioned that they were thinking of having a night patrol of sorts if things kept up. She wanted to know if I would volunteer if they did. She even offered to pay me for nights and would allow me to switch shifts. I told her if that's what she needed from me, I'd need a couple of nights to switch up my sleeping schedule, but I'd be more than happy to help out in any way I could. She told me that she'd be able to do that if the need came and told me to enjoy my weekend. I was off and the next weekend went well. Monday morning, though, that all changed. I was due to come in that morning, and looking back now, I wish I wasn't. We have a weekend shift for newer rangers, and upon arriving Monday morning, it was quickly evident something was wrong. I found our main station wrecked. Most of the windows were busted. There was blood all over the building, and a disgusting trail, wound of red, seemed to lead from the broken down station door. Inside I found one of our rangers. She was no longer with us. I called the cops and explained the fact that I just entered the station when I found the scene at hand, unfortunately. The main station area is a little bit out of the way. It's far enough tourists and hikers aren't likely to run upon it unless they seek it out, but close enough we can respond to any emergencies or park needs. Sadly, it seems Rosalina, one of the weekend rangers, was due to close at some point. While closing, she was ambushed. The scene was something straight out of a horror movie. Sadly, it was all too real. Her stomach was completely torn open, and one of her legs as well, as some internal organs were found in the back of the station. It seemed whatever attacked her had eaten through her stomach, and then just violently ripped her remains to pieces. It looked calculated. Rosalina was alive as this thing tore into her. She was screaming, but we don't get a lot of visitors on Sundays, and I'm guessing by closing, there wasn't anyone around that would hear or be able to help her. I remember my shock and anguish over the scene and everything that had happened. We were all at a loss, and it was quickly determined from this point forward, regardless of our shift, we'd be working in pairs from this point forward. The next couple of weeks were tense. There was a dark air about the park, and the police did all they could to work the case. It was determined ultimately that Rosalina had been mauled by some sort of animal, but what animal it might be was mostly up to speculation. I began working night shifts soon after this, and was paired with my boss. The nights were long at first. They were also unusually quiet. My boss and I kept together, and when we weren't together, we kept in radio contact if one of us patrolled while the other manned the station. It was around the 1st of November when I came upon a very odd sight. It appeared to be a shrine of sorts. There were dead animals and strange symbols, but what disturbed me the most wasn't the ritualistic staging of the area, but the picture I found. Painted in some of the animal blood, it showed a beast that looked like it could have been a wolf. The thing was huge, though, and as I gazed at the picture, I remember the unnerved feelings I felt. It was as though the eyes were upon me as I stared at the picture. There was nothing else about it, just this disturbing feeling of being watched. I remember I was about to radio my boss when I heard her voice behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin because I was so focused on the scene and that picture that I didn't hear her approaching me. She asked what had happened after apologizing for scaring me. I explained to her I found this weird shrine, and that's about all I knew. I remember her watching the area closely before saying we should look for who may have set this up. She volunteered to look if I would volunteer to start the cleanup. I asked her if it was such a good idea as I believed we shouldn't search alone. She nodded and told me to keep close to my radio and we'd split up. I agreed to this, but asked that we didn't stray too far away in case that one of us needed backup. She agreed and we went our separate ways. About an hour later I hear the most disturbing and pained screaming I've ever heard in my lifetime. I remember radioing my boss only to hear more screams and some sort of growling. I rushed over to where the screams were, which took me roughly 10 minutes. Once I arrived, I remember being overwhelmed by the horrid smell. My boss sat there, catatonic, as before her was the body of what looked to be a homeless man. The man's body parts were everywhere. This was the worst scene we'd happened upon yet. I came over to my boss and tried to bring her back. I remember she was shaking, and her eyes were wide open with terror. She had tears streaming down her face and she was shaking. I tried talking to her, but she didn't seem capable of speaking and she was in complete shock. I called the police and they came out. After questioning me and my boss, the paramedics checked my boss out and took her away. The scene itself was beyond disturbing. I never knew a person had so much blood inside them until I saw the homeless man's blood everywhere. My boss called me a little later and explained she'd been out for a couple of weeks and she needed to relax and get some rest. About a week later, while I was watching the park with Harold, one of our newer recruits, we heard a loud howling and animal screams. I didn't want to take a chance and split up this time, so I asked Harold to stick with me and we'd investigate the scene together. We did just that, and eventually, we happened upon a stray cat that was laying on its side, bleeding out. I remember immediately being worried about this cat, but then being overtaken by this overwhelming sense of dread. It was kind of like when you do something and realize you've made a horrible, horrible mistake, but it's too late to correct it. No sooner had the thought crossed my mind did I hear a loud roar, and in the blink of an eye, Harold was tackled to the ground and screaming. It all happened so fast. Harold was being mauled and it took me a second to process it all. When I did, I remember running up and trying to punch this behemoth of a monster in the side. It paid me no mind as it buried its teeth into Harold's stomach and began tearing him open. I fell back in shock. I didn't believe what I was seeing, and I felt I was beginning to spiral into a state of denial. I remember the mace I had on me and ran up and sprayed this thing in the eyes. It quickly backhanded me and I hit a tree. I remember my head smacking with a hard thud, and things were a bit blurry after that. The next thing I remember, I'm awakened in the hospital. I shot up, freaked out only to realize where I was. A nurse rushed in and called for the doctors, telling them I was awake. I was asked a series of questions and told I had a light concussion and I had some bad bruising, but otherwise I would be fine. It was then I remembered Harold and I began frantically saying his name as it was the only thing I could get out. They told me not to worry about him and to explain what I remembered about the situation. Some officers came in and we talked for a bit about what I remembered, and soon after that they left. They weren't sure what to make of my description of this black-furred giant wolf, but they didn't mock me either. I spent a few more days in the hospital while they monitored me. It was during that time I eventually found out that Harold had passed away. They didn't go into many details about that, but I could imagine it wasn't a pretty scene. I sat for much of my time in the hospital feeling depressed and blaming myself for Harold's death. It wasn't until my last day, where my boss visited, that I finally got my head in a halfway normal pace again. My boss told me she was sorry about what happened, and that we were going to end the night shift for the other rangers' safety. We still work in pairs while out there in the day, though. I was given a couple weeks off in addition to time off during the holidays. When I finally returned in January, everything was quiet. The holidays had gone mostly news-free. The park had returned to some semblance of normalcy. The month of January proved to be rather tame, and I had finally gotten back into the groove of the daily routine of the job. It wasn't until the first week of February that things came to a head. I volunteered to close up while my boss left early and handled some errands she had. All assigned rangers that day had gone home. I had gone ahead and sent Mark, the ranger that was supposed to close with me, home. He wanted to stay, but I foolishly told him things had been quiet and it'd be fine. I told him to go home to his wife and enjoy his weekend. Anyway, I was doing my final rounds and it was getting close to dark when I heard a scream. The scream had sent panicked thoughts racing through my mind and my adrenaline spiked again. In my time off, I'd gotten very familiar with firearms and I now carry one quietly on my person. I clocked out and decided to head toward the direction of the screaming. I thought about calling the police, but I wanted to see what was going on before involving them. This was a mistake, I know. As I got closer to the screams, I saw a broken cell phone. I immediately drew my weapon and cautiously walked forward. I arrived in a clearing to find a young woman, her legs separated from her body, white as a ghost and trying to speak. I looked around as I approached her, and that's when I was hit by something that felt like a truck and was suddenly on my back. My gun had slid away, and looking me in the eyes was that damned wolf that had mauled Harold to death. I remember my knife and ripped it from the holster before stabbing this beast in the left eye. I did it almost like an instantaneous reaction to my situation. I didn't think about it. I instinctively attacked. I don't know if I was pissed about Harold or the other rangers, or I was more concerned with my own survival. But, whatever the case, this creature yelped and leaped back for a moment. I took my opportunity and scrambled to my gun before standing up and staring this creature in its cold, black, lifeless eyes. I remember it taking its paws and using them to remove the knife from its own eye before growling a hatred I had never encountered before. The thing howled and ran from me, at which point I emptied the bullets in my magnum into this thing. The creature stopped in its tracks and fell back a bit, staggered. I reloaded my weapon. The creature began coming toward me slowly this time, bleeding from the bullet wounds and its eye. It fell over, coughing up blood, and glared before howling one last time and rushing into the woods. I remember seeing this girl's fail-paced look as she clung to life. I did all I could to help slow the bleeding while I dialed 911. It took no time at all to arrive, at which point the young woman was carried off and I was questioned. Ultimately, I took over duties as the head of the rangers at our park. The woman who I had found with her legs ripped off survived. The most unnerving and unexplainable part of this entire series of encounters was that of my boss. The day she went running errands, also the same day I fought the beast, she went missing. She never returned and was never found. What was found, though, was her husband. She and her husband had issues from time to time, and there were rumors that they were going to be divorcing in the future. She'd even talked to me about it briefly one night while we worked the night shift. That's what is so strange and unexplainable about her disappearance, though. Her husband, well, he was found ripped to pieces in their bed a week or so after the events of that day. He had died the same day I had been attacked. I don't know how to explain it, but I believe whatever that beast was, well, I think it was my boss. My name is Daniel, and I was with the park rangers in Texas for roughly 13 years. I've seen all manners of crazy things in my time. I've seen murders, weird unexplained phenomena, possible UFO sightings, and even had a run-in or two with the odd crazed homeless person. Something that isn't often talked about in regards to park ranger work is that while most days things are perfectly normal, a few, if any, rangers get through a career without witnessing or experiencing some sort of strange happening in their time. It feels like the longer I've been a ranger, the more strange stuff I've seen. Well, probably 4 years ago, I want to say, we started having some really odd occurrences around many of our parks. The first time I encountered something like this, it was April of 2015. I was supervising and filling reports out at the main station of the park. Suddenly, as I was doing this, I heard my radio go off. I responded and asked what was wrong when one of the guys informed me that they kept hearing crying in the woods. I was a bit busy, so I gruffly told them, "So go investigate it then, and report back when you find out what is going on." That's when they explained to me they had been investigating, but they hadn't found anyone, and every time they were sure they had found the source of the crying, it sounded like it would get farther away all of a sudden. I told them to search the area again, as we weren't in a huge park, and then if they found nothing, call me and I'd go look myself while they clocked out and headed home. About a half hour later, they radioed back and they had found no one, but the crying had stopped. I told them, "Thank you. Come back to the station and clock out, and I'd check again to be safe." They arrived and we talked briefly before the ranger left. I finished my paperwork, a little late, clocked out, and took my flashlight and headed over towards the woods. It was while I was out there and scanning the place twice over, I heard nothing and found nothing weird or suspicious. Because of this, I went ahead and just went back to the station. It should be noted, I was the only one left at the park of staff at this time. I reached the station and got in my truck. I was beginning to pull away when my radio was taken by static, and there was crying over it. I stopped the truck and listened closely. It sounded like it could have been a child crying, and it wasn't long before the station returned to normal and I decided to shake off the odd happening and head home. Saturday morning, I was awoken to a phone call from the local sheriff. They said there was a body hanging in the woods. It was a little girl, and it appeared she had hung herself. I thanked the sheriff for the info and came up to the station. One of the weekend staffers had found the body while doing their morning rounds and was justifiably shocked by the entire situation. I'll admit I was taken a bit aback and considering what I'd heard the night previously, but I was absolutely certain there was no sound when I left the park that night. A few months went by and I was working at a much larger park at this point when I got a call from one of the rangers that took me by surprise. It was another call about crying in the woods. I asked them where they were hearing it, and their response made me a little uneasy. They said they were hearing it from everywhere. I asked the ranger to elaborate and they explained something eerily similar to the previous report at the park a few months back. They said they'd followed the sound of crying and every time they thought they'd found the source, the crying would sound as though it was from way farther away. I told them to wait for me as I headed up that way. I arrived to something truly strange. The crying was indeed still happening, and try as we might, we could not find the source anywhere. I told the ranger to head home, and I called the sheriff's office and asked if they could spare someone to keep watch over the area overnight. After a lot of discussions, they said they'd see if they could get someone off duty to watch the place overnight. I informed them of my concerns, and they agreed it was worth watching over the place, just in case. I went home that night and crashed rather quickly, comfortable in the idea that someone was watching the park. It was about midnight when I awoke to a phone call from the sheriff's office. They explained how one of their off-duty deputies began to hear the crying I mentioned. They said they followed the source until eventually they found a body, hanging from a tree. I headed up to the park and talked to the off-duty deputy. They seemed shocked. It wasn't just the body of a teenage girl that left them in shock. It was the fact that upon finding the body, of which there had been no trace of during their previous patrols, they were still hearing the crying. They said the crying only stopped when the sheriff arrived. I thought this was odd, and I was beginning to feel unnerved about it all. 2 separate parks, 2 separate incidents, 2 different suicides. It was more than a little odd. It was about to get odder, though. A month later, I was assigned to work in my hometown again. I was more than a little relieved by this, and I was pretty excited to finally be back home. I'd been home for about a month when I began hearing the all-too-familiar sound. It was the crying. The thing was, it wasn't at the park this time. No, it was in the woods on my property. Need to understand right off the bat I live alone and in the middle of nowhere. I shouldn't be hearing crying of any kind. I took my flashlight and shotgun and headed out of my home. I checked my watch and it was about 10:30 at night. I canvassed my property the entire night. As the sun was coming up, the crying had stopped. I took that opportunity to go back to bed as it was Sunday and I didn't have to work. I awoke at about 5 in the evening to the sound of distant crying once again. I called up the sheriff's office and told them I'd wait up for them before searching the property. The sheriff arrived at 6 and we began canvassing my property together. By 9 p.m. we were about to call the search off when we heard the unnerving laughter. The sheriff and I walked in the direction of the sound, and upon cresting the hill, we found the single most disturbing sight that I've ever seen in my entire lifetime. It was a circle with a pentagram inside of it. The thing was, though, the circle and pentagram were made of the naked bodies of women. The most disturbing part is that they all had smiles on their faces. I didn't sleep very well the rest of that night, and after the investigation was complete, it appeared the woman had committed suicide. It seemed they had poisoned themselves before holding hands and forming this symbol in the spot of their death. I can tell you right now, I've never felt so unnerved in my life. It wasn't just the strange nature of the deaths, but the fact these suicides kept following me. I wasn't sure where this would end or how, but I was beginning to feel very unsafe. This was further reinforced by the fact that this one had happened on my own property. The next couple of weeks I didn't get much sleep. I kept having horrific nightmares of the dead bodies on my property. I couldn't get it out of my head. Sometimes I'd awake in a panic thinking I heard crying again, but ultimately it turned out it was all in my dreams. I remember pondering what the hell was happening and why it had happened. It wasn't much longer before I was assigned to go out of town again. I took this opportunity happily. I'd barely gotten any rest and I wasn't feeling the safest at home anymore. This was strengthened my final night at home when I woke up to the sound of 3 loud knocks at my door at 2 a.m. I checked the door with my gun, of course, but all I found was a picture in red ink of the pentagram with the bodies. I burned the thing and went to bed. Now that I was out of town, I hoped things would settle for a bit. Sadly, they didn't. My first day of work, we began hearing cries in the wood. We had local law enforcement monitoring the park that night, with who they could spare and myself as well. The cries began around sunset. It was almost as though they had been planned. We searched the place high and low and found nothing. I remained there the whole night, eventually sleeping in the station. I was awoken that morning to screaming. I scrambled to my feet and opened the door to find one of the rangers staring in shock. I nearly slipped, and after regaining my balance, I looked down to see blood. Pinned to the door was a woman's decapitated head. She still wore a smile. Law enforcement was called immediately, and I was grilled about it if I was connected to all of this. I vehemently denied any involvement, and found myself disturbed by what had happened. On the door, it read a message. I give myself to you. The victim had been identified, but whoever had decapitated her hadn't. The handwriting of the note was that of the victims. None of this made any sense, and I was more than freaked out at this point. I took some time off of work, and while I wasn't allowed to leave the state as I was technically considered a person of interest, I was allowed to go home. Every night I was awoken to 3 knocks at random points each night. I was usually left a gift of some kind by who I didn't know. Sometimes it was dead animals, other time it was weird poetry, and more times than not, odd symbols. I had local law enforcement around my place 24/7, and no one ever saw who left these gifts. Eventually, these strange noises stopped. I was having trouble sleeping, and I was spooked enough that I went ahead and resigned from my position. I'm not sure what was up with the suicides or the strange sacrifices. I still do not know to this day. That said, some nights, even now, I'm awoken to knocks. The only difference being, no one is there, and now nothing is left behind. I could still hear the crying though, every time. I'm a 30-year-old female park ranger who works out of New Jersey. My story takes place in 2012 and involves a strange occurrence around my park. Before we get started, no, it wasn't the Jersey Devil. I won't list where I work as I still work there and I don't wish to have my colleagues think ill of me. Anyway, it was around the holidays and we were having a nighttime event to celebrate. A few rangers, myself included, volunteered to watch over the event for some extra pay despite the fact we were normally on vacation. All we were to do during this event was watch over it, patrol the woods to make sure there was nothing weird going on, and help clean up at the end to make sure the park was in order. Being I didn't really want to be around the party itself, I volunteered to patrol the woods. I've always been a bit of a recluse and I've always found the woods relaxing, day or night. On this night, however, that would change. It was about 9 p.m. and there were fireworks being set off. We'd gotten approval to do this prior, and from the cheering in the distance, it seemed everyone was having a great time. Shortly after the fireworks rang out, I heard an inhuman scream. It was almost like a screech more than a scream, and the initial sound of it made me jump. I quickly looked toward the sky, as that's where I heard the noise. It was then I noticed something in the trees. It looked like a shadow. It had clear, red eyes. There were no wings that I could see, and this figure seemed to curl on a branch and leer at me. I slowly moved from my radio, but this figure seemed to emit a high-pitched signal that made me drop my radio and grip my ears. When the noise stopped, I realized my radio was no longer functioning, and I looked up to see the odd shadow had vanished. I'm not one to give up easily, and I also have a really morbid curiosity. This is probably to my detriment, and I'm quite sure it'll get me killed someday. That said, being the morbidly curious soul I am, I went searching for this odd shadow creature. I searched for roughly 2 hours. When I heard fireworks and the same screeching again, whatever this thing was didn't like the sound of fireworks, and as I closed in on the sound, I noticed the shadowy figure once again lurking in the trees. I walked slowly toward it, at which point it seemed to turn its head backward like an owl and stared at me. That was pretty off-putting, but what was more unnerving was the meat. Now, inside the mouth of this thing, it was now that I could easily see the large, extremely sharp teeth that seemed to gleam in the moonlight. The blood from its prey freshly dripping from the thing's shadowy lips. It was at that moment I decided it was far better to back away slowly and leave the woods. As soon as I turned around, I heard movement and a high-pitched screeching erupted in the air again. I remember a ringing, piercing my ears as I fell to my knees, cupping my ears with my hands once again. When the screeching stopped, I was having trouble hearing and could see blood coming from my ears. I remember being frozen in fear and thinking to myself that I was an idiot. I thought I was about to die here, a victim to something that no one knew existed. I waited, a bit dizzy and unable to really move as I felt a cold breathing right across my neck. I closed my eyes and shook in terror as I felt the thing slowly study me. I soon broke down crying, assuring this thing I meant no harm and begging it not to kill me. I had a thought cross my mind about how silly I was, as I was appealing to something that was clearly a carnivorous predator of some sort. I heard a strange cooing. That's the best way I can describe it. And soon after I felt a strong wind. Then all was silent. There wasn't the sound of animals or anything. Granted, things were sort of muted as my ears were still ringing at the time. It was another half an hour before my ears began to dull and I was no longer afraid to move. I slowly got to my feet and scanned the area. There was nothing there. Deciding to no longer seek this creature out or test my luck again, I went ahead and began heading back. As I walked, I remember feeling something watching me. In fact, I'm quite sure this thing was stalking me now as I slowly walked out. I was too afraid to look behind me, instead opted to continue walking and promising myself as I was not going to stop for any reason. Eventually, I did reach the tree line and head out of the woods. My colleagues asked where I was and I explained my radio died and may have malfunctioned, not saying why it was. Before joining them for the cleanup, the rest of the night went fine and I eventually went to the hospital to get checked out. They said I had permanent hearing loss, but there didn't seem to be any other negative effects. They did several scans and nothing of note was found. I never explained what had happened or why I lost part of my hearing, but to this day, I'll never forget what happened out there in the woods. Now, even when working, I'm a bit skittish, even when I'm not in the woods. This is usually more in the winter when it gets darker, earlier. I've never seen this mysterious and shadowy creature since, and I found no research that would allude to what it could have been. I'm positive it isn't the Jersey Devil though. That said, whatever it is, it's still out there. So, if you're ever out in the woods of New Jersey at night, know, there is more to be wary of than just the Jersey Devil. My story takes place in my first year as a park ranger. The staff around the park had shared with me stories of weird goings-on around the park when I was first hired. It was enough of a topic of talk that it was actually brought up right after I had been told I was going to be hired. I work in North Dakota, and I'd say my 5 years as a ranger have actually been relatively tame. The exception being while hanging around the station. Nothing violent has ever come of these happenings, but I have been more than a little unnerved in my time while working here. What is it that is so unnerving to me, you ask? Well, things have a tendency to move on their own. I'm not just talking someone messing with us. I'm talking full on-camera footage of things moving. The first time I experienced this was in my first year. It was caught on camera, but I was also there. I was making some coffee and went to grab some sugar packets. When I was reaching out for the packets, the container carrying them slid further to my left. I looked around to make sure no one was around when I remembered checking the cameras after. It definitely happened. Still, this wasn't as strange as something that happened while patrolling the park one evening before closing. I was out on my own and picking up trash and checking on the status of things before I left for the weekend. My supervisor was at the station waiting for me to wrap things up. While patrolling and getting ready to head back to the station, my radio went off. It was my supervisor telling me to come back to the station now. I quickly ran back without even responding. When I got back, my supervisor asked why I was back so quickly. I explained he had just yelled for me to rush back over the radio, at which point he looked at me like I was stupid. I sat in silence for a moment before explaining my situation again. He shook his head and swore to me that he didn't call for me at all. I shrugged it off and just told him I didn't see anything off and everything seemed fine otherwise, and then I headed home. Somewhat embarrassed but also suspicious of my boss. Monday rolled around and we all arrived to a not-so-fun surprise. The main station had been vandalized. The thing is though, when we checked the footage, things were flying around, but there was seemingly no one throwing them. Odd as it was, we all just decided to start the morning cleaning up and then hit our morning patrol right after. At this point, I'd begun to grow accustomed to the strange happenings around the park and station. So, when an odd thing would move or a strange sound would occur, I'd basically grown to ignore it. The main point of my story, however, the thing is, I will explain now, was not something I could simply ignore away. I was driving in a cart along the hiking trail when I suddenly saw a disheveled woman coming out of the tree line. She was bleeding profusely. I immediately stopped the cart and came to her aid. The woman began vomiting blood inside my arms, and I was about to radio the main station when just as quickly as I blinked, there was no woman and there was no blood. I stood there in shock for a moment before regaining my senses. Searching the area thoroughly, I found no trail of blood, no woman, nothing. Even as I speak about this now, I'm in shock. I was late for my morning patrol. My supervisor wanted to know what was up. I didn't know what to say, but because he could clearly see shock on my face, he persisted with questioning me. I eventually broke down and explained everything I had seen. That was when he got some water and told me to come to his office. My supervisor explained how he realized I was newer to the area, and that while I seemed very real and understood my shock, he assured me it was okay. I looked at my boss dumbfounded at how he could think it was okay. He could clearly see my thoughts all over my face, and he immediately explained some of the history behind the park and area. He said it was likely the ghost of a woman murdered in the park several years prior. I asked how he was so nonchalant about the situation, but he explained everyone at the park has seen the woman's ghost at one point or another and had the same reaction. He described the woman to me and I confirmed that was who I saw to the tiniest detail. I didn't find this situation funny, but my boss had a smile and told me, "Congrats, you are now officially one of the team." Looking back and having gotten to know the man better, I realized my boss wasn't making light of the murder, but more of the reaction of me seeing this ghost. He and all the staff had experienced this woman in the same area at different periods through their time at the park. I'm now a lot more relaxed about the whole thing, and I guess I shouldn't be shocked, considering the other weird things that had happened here previously. Still, if you'd have been there, if you'd have seen how real it was, I imagined you'd have a similar reaction. I still work at the park now, and strange things still happen, but I've never encountered anything as strange as that since. Anyway, thank you for sharing my story, and I apologize if it was a bit brief. I'm not even sure how to begin this story. I have been, and still am, working for the park rangers in Washington. I love my job, and despite the events of the story, I still love my job to this day. I've been doing this for about 25 years, and am getting to retire at the end of this year, actually. What I'm about to explain will make a little sense, but I'll do my best to explain it anyway. The first thing you need to understand is that the origins of these incidents are still up for debate, as these have not been solved, nor were any of them covered by the news or given to public knowledge. I've always been a believer in odd things. I've been this way since I was a kid. I used to see ghosts. I stopped talking about such things when I realized people thought I was strange. I know it's going to seem silly after hearing this, but I assure you I am of sound mind and very logical in my thoughts overall. I'm not crazy, and this story has nothing to do with ghosts. This story has to do with disappearances of missing people. This story has to do with disappearances and missing persons. 10 years into my job was when the first disappearance happened. We have a lot of woods up here in Washington. It also rains a fair amount around here. While working a seemingly normal day, one evening it began to rain. The rain was heavy and there was a thick fog because of the conditions. That said, I thought nothing of it. A few days later, we had someone come into the main station and report a missing family member. They mentioned they had been missing for a few days at this point, and the last place they were known was to be hiking in our park. I took down their information and the information of the missing family member and assured them we'd do all we could do to aid law enforcement in their search for the missing family member. We spent the next few days searching high and low for the missing family member. Eventually, we found something. What we found was more than a little odd, though. It was shoes. The shoes were taken in for DNA testing and were found to match that of the missing family member. Law enforcement informed the family members of the missing person about our findings, and we also assured them we'd keep searching. Sadly, we never found further evidence of this missing soul. There are few feelings as horrible as a family member who keeps coming in or calling for information on their missing loved one, only for you to have to tell them, sorry, you have no further information on their whereabouts. It cuts you as deep as something possibly can emotionally, and I don't look forward to doing this. A year went by and we never found the missing person. Things would get stranger in October when another seemingly normal day would be plagued by sudden rain. We get rain, and often it is easy to forecast, but this rain seemed sudden, and I'm positive there was no forecast of rain. Still, a forecast is just that. A forecast. It's not 100% accurate, and Mother Nature will do whatever she wishes to do, ultimately. Looking back, I get a sense of déjà vu about this day. I didn't pick up on it at the time, but the conditions were the same as the day of the first missing person. A sudden rain, a heavy fog, and then a few days later, a man came in reporting his daughter missing. The only real difference is this time it was a man reporting a daughter missing, whereas the previous was a woman's brother. Still, a missing person is sad all the same. When the second missing person was reported, we followed procedure and started to search immediately. Before the day was over, we had found something that did strike us all odd at the time. We found a pair of shoes once again. There was no gear, no clothing, just the shoes. There were no signs of any further movement and no sort of forensic evidence that might lead to where this woman had gone. Much like the missing man, she had seemingly come to a random spot in the woods and simply vanished, leaving only her shoes behind. We searched high and low and never found any sort of evidence as to where the latest missing person or the previous one had gone. A few months went by, and this time I was fully aware how strange the circumstances were. It was a Friday morning and there was 0% chance of rain. I'm absolutely certain of this. Still, about 3 in the afternoon, a heavy rain set in out of nowhere and a heavy fog accompanying it. The sense of déjà vu hit me immediately this time, as opposed to in hindsight. It hit me so strongly, in fact, that I decided to go out and canvass the area on my own, immediately. I spent the better part of the afternoon and evening in search. When the rain finally let up, I found a couple of pairs of shoes, called the police that second. They came and took the evidence. I was asked about why I'd begun a search without a missing person investigation opened, and I explained that after the previous 2 times, that I had an off feeling and wanted to search the grounds. This naturally made me a person of interest, but I was quickly cleared and able to return to work within a few days. The people that went missing were a young couple in their 20s, who were actually vacationing and on their honeymoon. We searched high and low for them as well, and the others, but we only found the same things, their shoes. There were always shoes left behind, nothing else. It was as though they would vanish into thin air. I feel an endless amount of guilt for the missing and the circumstances are just odd. 5 years later, it happened once more. We had been in a week of sunshine, and it was a Sunday that seemed as though it would be no different. There was no rain forecasted off for the next 10 days at the least. I was actually off when this one happened. Heavy rain set in out of the blue, and even heavier fog set in with it. I remember shaking out of worry about the circumstances, and the sense of deja vu I got was jarring. I called the police, and they explained that they had already had a few units at the park, searching the area. It was about 6 that evening when I got a call saying a family of 6 had gone missing. Their shoes were all that remained. I wasn't sure what to say or how to react anymore. I couldn't begin to explain what was happening to the missing. I still work as a park ranger, and we've never had another missing case like these ones around the park since. No similar weather pattern that wasn't forecasted, none of that. I'm retiring at the end of the year, however. My disdain for being unable to solve these disappearances or get these families of the missing closure will haunt me for the remainder of my days. Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright strange park ranger stories. There are some really strange things happening out in those woods, and state parks and national parks all over this country. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, whether it's a park ranger story or something different, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp, and stories like yours that keep this channel going. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new eyes. If you're new to the channel, why not join the swamp? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a new upload, as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you aren't aware, I do have a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and pretty much every other major podcast provider. Be sure to check them out simply by searching Swamp Dweller on your favorite podcasting website. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.